Hello everyone, and welcome to my channel. This is an educational channel where we delve into great theories of everything, ancient and modern, mostly pretty obscure, put together by people who spent their whole life working on something, never got any credit, had all the struggles of working alone and in an unknown field, but still kept at it and put together something at the end of their life, like a tour de force, a magnum opus, earth-shattering discoveries. And we're trying to help me to use these things in our own lives to accentuate the positive, to help our quest for better spiritual, mental, and physical health, our awakening to 5D consciousness, our formation of a holistic worldview, our paradigm shifting, and our longing for freedom and sovereignty. And today is our 20th video that we've done on the book called The Dead Sea Scrolls Deception. And this is by Bajent and Lee, and it came out in 1991. The Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in 1947 in Qumran, 20 miles southeast of Jerusalem, and they were discovered in a series of caves over the course of about 10 years. And they're voluminous, but there are copies of each book of the Old Testament, except for Esther, and many copies of some of the books, like 30 copies of the Psalms. But there are also a lot of other documents, poetry, and sectarian writings. These were probably put together by some sect of hardcore religionists, Jews, in the 1st century BC and the 1st century AD. And there's some dispute as to when all these things came from, but the deception that is involved is that an international team of scholars was appointed to catalog, decipher, translate, and disseminate the Dead Sea Scrolls to the public, the other scholars, and the lay public. But 44 years on, well, the international team, say 30 years on, they had published about 8 books of pretty much irrelevancies, and all the important potentially explosive material lay hidden in their hands. They began to translate these things, and they discovered that they said a lot of things that they didn't want, that they didn't like. These international team of scholars were mostly Catholic priests, especially from the École Biblique. And so they just started to kick the can down the road and stall and obfuscate and flat out refuse to publish anything about these things for years and years and years, until Robert Eisenman and the Herschel Shanks and some other people began to get loud and organized about their quest. I mean, imagine being a biblical scholar, and you hear about these documents, and like for your whole career you don't get to see them. you don't ever get to see them. They could be, they could have and they do have a lot of bearing on many elements of biblical scholarship, Old Testament and New Testament, because the language, especially in the sectarian material that is used, is extremely reminiscent, if not a copy of, or a precursor to the language in the Gospels. And so there's a lot of connections there. And for just a whole generation or two, we haven't been able to see these things, but they've come out now. So hopefully this, is something that happened in the past, but it is a lesson from history. But it also, this source also does give a decent kind of contextual information behind the Dead Sea Scrolls, and also like what's in them, the catalog. We just went through a chapter where it cataloged a number of the sectarian documents and kind of like what's in them. And we may look at some of the primary sources at some point, some of those sectarian documents, or the commentary on Habakkuk, or possibly something else. But right now we're still in that same chapter, chapter 9. Oh no, I believe this is chapter 10. And we're talking about DeVoe, who is the Dominican priest who is the leader of the international team until his death in 1971. And it's kind of talking about how DeVoe parried any information that he didn't like, and amplified any information that he did like. One important element for DeVoe was a thick layer of ash found to be blanketing the surroundings of the ruins. This layer of ash patently attested to a fire of some sort, which had obviously caused considerable destruction. Indeed, it had led to Qumran's being partially, if not wholly, abandoned for some years. A study of the coins found at the site revealed that the fire had occurred at some time toward the beginning of the reign of Herod the Great, who occupied the throne from 37 BC until 4 BC. The same data indicated that rebuilding had commenced under the regime of Herod's son, Archelaus, who ruled not as a king but as ethnarch from 4 BC until 6 AD. According to DeVoe's thesis, the Qumran community consisted of supposedly placid, peace-loving, ascetic Essenes, on good terms with Herod as with everyone else. If this were the case, the fire which destroyed the community should have resulted not from any deliberate human intention, from an act of war, for example, but from an accident or a natural disaster. Fortunately for DeVoe, a large crack was found running through a cistern. Although independent researchers found no indication that the crack extended any further, DeVoe claimed to have traced it through the whole of the ruins, the whole of the Qumran community. Even if it did, a number of experts concluded, it could probably be ascribed to erosion. For DeVoe, however, the crack, such as it was, seemed the result of one of the many earthquakes the region had suffered over the centuries. Instead of trying to identify the cause of the crack, in other words, DeVoe went rummaging for an earthquake that might have been responsible. As it happens, there was a more or less convenient earthquake on record. Josephus speaks of one that occurred toward the beginning of Herod's reign in 31 BC. This, DeVoe concluded, had caused the fire, which led to the abandoning of the community. He did not bother to explain why rebuilding did not commence for a quarter of a century before suddenly proceeding with noticeable rapidity. Robert Eisenman points to the strikingly precise timing of the delay in rebuilding. Now, I have seen it, I'm not sure what author came to this conclusion, but that the hardcore religious people that lived there at Qumran abandoned the place after the earthquake because they believed that God put a curse on it that lasted for 20 years, and they didn't return for 20 more years. But it looks like it would be more like 25 or 30 years. Archelaus rebuilt the site under sometime between 4 BC and AD 6, so maybe for 30 years. But it's interesting that DeVoe just kind of created that out of nothing, the fire and the earthquake and the abandonment, and I don't know who, whatever author I saw kind of piled on and just said, oh, because they figured that God had put a curse on the place or whatever. So who knows? Robert Eisenman points to the strikingly precise timing of the delay in rebuilding. It coincides perfectly with Herod's reign. No sooner had he died than reconstruction promptly began. And part of this reconstruction consisted of strengthening the defensive towers as well as creating a rampart. It would thus seem clear, for some reason which DeVoe chose to ignore, that no one dared to rebuild Qumran while Herod remained on the throne. But why should that be the case if the community were on as congenial a footing with Herod as DeVoe maintained, and if the destruction of the community resulted from an earthquake? It would appear much more likely that the community was destroyed deliberately on Herod's orders, and that no reconstruction could begin until after his death. But why should Herod order the destruction of a community so placid, so universally loved, so divorced from political activity? Whether willfully or through negligence, DeVoe remained oblivious of such questions. Eventually, however, the logic he mustered to support his hypothetical earthquake became too strained even for the closest of his supporters, the then Father Malik. In 1957, Malik wrote of the fire and the alleged earthquake that, quote, the archaeological evidence from Qumran is not ambiguous as to the order of these two events. The thick layers of ashes suggests a very violent conflagration, better to be explained as a result of a conscious attempt to burn down the whole building, so the ashes may show the traces of an intentional destruction of Qumran. Whether the fire was caused by earthquake or by deliberate human agency cannot be definitively established. Certainly the evidence offers less support to DeVoe than it does to Malik and Eisenman, who, on this unique occasion, are in accord. Nevertheless, many adherents of the consensus still invoke the earthquake, and it still figures with metronomic regularity in their texts. In another instance, however, DeVoe's misinterpretation of the evidence, or to put the matter charitably, wishful thinking, was much more conclusively exposed. Very early in his excavations, he found a heavily oxidized coin on which he said he believed he could discern the insignia of the Roman 10th Legion. Purporting to cite Josephus, he also said that the 10th Legion had conquered Jericho 8 miles away in June of AD 68. Everything seemed to fit nicely. On the basis of his coin, DeVoe argued that Qumran must have been destroyed by the 10th Legion in AD 68. No manuscript of the caves, he later declared, waxing dogmatic on the basis of questionable data, can be later than June AD 68. DeVoe had first described his discovery of the coin in 1954 in Revue Biblique. He repeated his account 5 years later in 1959 in the same journal. The fact of the coin and DeVoe's emphatic dating on the basis of it thus became enshrined in the established corpus of evidence routinely invoked by adherents of the consensus. I've definitely also heard that Qumran was, ended in AD 68 from some other source. That it's probably just going along for the ride. Thus, for example, Frank Cross would write that the coin stamped with the insignia of the 10th Legion constituted grim confirmation. DeVoe, however, had made two bizarre errors. In the first place, he had somehow contrived to misread Josephus, ascribing to Josephus precisely the opposite of what Josephus in fact said. Josephus most emphatically did not assert that the 10th Legion captured Jericho in AD 68. As Professor Cecil Roth demonstrated, of the 3 Roman legions in the vicinity, only the 10th was not engaged in the conquest of Jericho. The 10th Legion had remained a considerable distance to the north, guarding the top of the Jordan Valley. In the second place, the coin DeVoe had proved not to be from the 10th Legion at all, or, for that matter, from any other. Although badly damaged and oxidized, the coin, when subjected to expert scrutiny, proved to have come from Ashkelon and to date from AD 72 or 73. Here was a blunder that could not be equivocated away. DeVoe had no choice but to publish a formal retraction. This retraction, however, appeared only as a footnote in his opus L'archéologie et les manuscrits de la Mer Morte, published in French in 1961 and in English in 1973. Mention of this was unfortunate, DeVoe says laconically, for this coin does not exist. On the whole, DeVoe tended to be shamelessly cavalier in his conclusions about coins. When he found any that did not conform to his theories, he simply dismissed them. Thus, for example, he found one dating from the period between 138 and 161 AD. He shrugged off its possible relevance with the comment that it must have been lost by a passerby. By the same token, of course, an earlier coin on which he attempted to establish his dating and chronology for Qumran could also have been lost by a passerby. But DeVoe seems not to have considered this possibility. Of the archaeological evidence found at Qumran, coins have been particularly important to the international team and the adherents of their consensus. Indeed, it was on the basis of this evidence that they deduced the time span of the community, and it was through their interpretation of this evidence that they established their dating and chronology. Prior to Eisenman, however, no one had bothered to question their misinterpretation. Roth and Driver, as we have seen, endeavored to establish a chronology on the basis of the internal evidence of the scrolls themselves. DeVoe and the international team were able to discredit them simply by invoking the external evidence supposedly provided by the coins. That this evidence had been spuriously interpreted went unnoticed. Eisenman recognized that Roth and Driver, arguing on the basis of internal evidence, had in fact been correct. But in order to prove this, he had first to expose the erroneous interpretation of the external evidence. He began with the coin distribution, pointing out that they revealed 2 periods of peak activity. Some 450 bronze coins were discovered at Qumran in the course of excavation. They encompassed a span of some 2.5 centuries, from 135 BC to AD 136. The following table groups them according to the reigns in which they were minted. So there's just one coin from 135 to 104 BC. One coin at 104 BC. 143 coins from 103 to 76 BC. One coin from 76 to 67 BC. 5 coins from 67 to 40 BC. 4 coins from 40 to 37 BC. 10 coins from 37 to 4 BC. 16 coins from 4 BC to 6 AD. 91 coins from 6 AD to 41 AD. 78 coins from 37 AD to 44 AD. 2 Roman coins from 54 AD to 68 AD. 83 coins from 67 AD, the second year of the revolt. 5 coins from 68 AD. And then 6 additional coins, more precisely from the revolt, to oxidize to identify. 13 coins, 67 to 68 AD. 1 coin, 1 Roman coin. The 13 coins are Roman also. 1 Roman coin from 69 to 79 AD. 2 coins, 72 to 73 AD. 4 coins, 72 to 81 AD. 1 Roman coin, 87 AD. 3 Roman coins from 98 to 117. 6 coins from 132 to 136. So, the distribution of coins would appear to indicate 2 periods when the community at Qumran was most active, that between 103 and 76 BC, and that between 6 AD and 67 AD. There are a total of 143 coins from the former period, 254 from the latter. For adherents of the consensus, this did not mesh as neatly as they would have liked it with their theories. According to their reading of the scrolls, the wicked priest was most likely to be identified as the high priest Jonathan, who lived between 160 and 142 BC, half a century before the first concentration of coins. In order to support his thesis, Father DeVoe needed a very early date for the founding of the Qumran community. He was thus forced to argue that the solitary coin, dating from between 135 and 104 BC, served to prove his thesis correct, even though common sense suggests that the community dates from between 103 and 76 BC, the period from which there is a concentration of 143 coins. The earlier coin on which DeVoe rests his argument is much more likely to have been merely one that remained in circulation for some years after it was minted. DeVoe ascribed particular significance to the disappearance of Judaic coins after 68 AD and the 19 Roman coins subsequent to that year. This, he maintained, proves that Qumran was destroyed in 68 AD. The Roman coins, he argued, indicated that the ruins were occupied by a detachment of Roman troops. On this basis, he proceeded to assign a definitive date to the deposition of the scrolls themselves. Our conclusion, quote, none of the manuscripts belonging to the community is later than the ruin of Khirbet Qumran in AD 68. The spuriousness of this reasoning is self-evident. In the first place, Judaic coins have been found which date from Simeon Bar Kokhba's revolt between AD 132 and 136. In the second place, the coins indicate only that people were wandering around Qumran and dropping them. They indicate nothing one way or the other about the deposition of manuscripts which could have been buried at Qumran as late as Bar Kokhba's time. And finally, it is hardly surprising that the coins subsequent to AD 68 should be Roman. In the years following the revolt, Roman coins were the only currency in Judea. This being the case, they need hardly have been dropped solely by Romans. Eisenman is emphatic about the conclusions to be drawn from DeVoe's archaeology. If it proves anything, he states, it proves precisely the opposite of what DeVoe concludes. Proves that the latest date for the scrolls having been deposited at Qumran is not AD 68, but AD 136. Any time up to that date would be perfectly consistent with the archaeological evidence. Nor, Eisenman adds, is the consensus correct in assuming that the destruction of the main buildings at Qumran necessarily meant the destruction of the site. There are, in fact, indications that at least some of the cursory or rudimentary rebuilding occurred, including a crude canal to feed water into a cistern. Rather unconvincingly, DeVoe claimed this to have been the work of the Roman garrison supposed on the basis of the coins to have occupied the site. But Professor Driver pointed out that the sheer crudeness of the reconstruction does not suggest Roman work. DeVoe maintained that his theory, conforming as it did to the alleged destruction of Qumran in 68 AD, was in accord with les données d'histoire, the accepted givens of history, having forgotten, as Professor Driver observed dryly, that the historical records say nothing of the destruction of Qumran in 68 AD by the Romans. In short, Driver concluded the données d'histoire are historical fiction. There is another crucial piece of archaeological evidence which runs diametrically counter to the interpretation of the consensus. DeVoe himself studiously and justifiably avoided referring to the ruins at Qumran as a monastery. He explained, he never used the word when writing about excavations at Qumran precisely because it represents an inference which archaeology taken alone could not warrant. It is clear, however, that he nevertheless thought of Qumran as a species of monastery. This is reflected by his uninhibited use of such monastic terms as scriptorium and refectory to describe certain of the structures. And if DeVoe himself had some reservations about dubbing Qumran a monastery, other adherents of the consensus did not. In his book on the Dead Sea Scrolls, for example, Cardinal Danilou babbled happily about the monks of Qumran, even going so far as to state that the monasticism of Qumran can be considered as the source of Christian monasticism. What DeVoe and his colleagues and adherents of the consensus chose consistently to overlook was the distinctly and unmistakably military character of some of the ruins. When one visits Qumran today, one will inevitably be struck, initially by the remains of a substantial defensive tower with walls of some feet in thickness and an entrance only on the second story. Less obvious, but just across a small passageway from the tower, there is another structure whose function may not be immediately apparent. In fact, it is what remains of a well-built forge, complete with its own water supply for tempering the tools and weapons crafted within it. Not surprisingly, the forge is something of an embarrassment to the scholars of the international team, clinging to their image of a placid, pacifist Essenes. Thus, DeVoe scuttled away from the issue as fast as tongue and pen could carry him. There was a workshop comprising a furnace, above which was a plastered area with a drainage conduit. The installation implies that the kind of work carried on there required a large fire as well as an abundant supply of water. I do not venture to define its purpose in any more precisely than that. Which is rather like not venturing to define the purpose of empty cartridge cases and spent projectiles of lead scattered around the OK Corral in Tombstone, Arizona. Professor Cross, following in DeVoe's footsteps, but incapable of the same disingenuousness, grudgingly alludes to what appears to have been a forge. In fact, arrows were found inside the ruins of Qumran, and while one could argue that these were loosed by attacking Romans, they are, as Professor Driver asserted, as likely to have belonged to the occupants, if not indeed more likely. On the whole, the military character of the ruins is so flagrant that another independent scholar, Professor Golb of the University of Chicago, has gone so far as to see in them an entirely martial installation. According to Golb, the scrolls were never composed or copied at Qumran at all, but were brought there from Jerusalem specifically for protection. No fragment of parchment or papyrus, Golb has pointed out, was ever found in the debris, nor any tools of scribes. Okay, we're going to stop right there for today, and we will get into more of the information about kind of what is in the archaeological record here at Qumran, and we'll do that tomorrow, so please come back. Thanks for tuning in today. Have a great day.